The faded receipt in my trembling hands told a story I never thought I'd have to confront at 52 years old. $28.50. That's what my childhood employer had paid me for a full week of scrubbing floors and washing dishes at Murphy's Diner when I was 14. I'd been so proud to hand that money over to my mother, thinking I was helping our struggling family. Now, 38 years later, I was staring at evidence that would shatter everything I believed about my childhood. I found the shoebox of old papers while cleaning out my late mother's attic, expecting to find nothing more than outdated tax returns and yellowed photographs. Instead, I discovered a carefully organized collection of every paycheck I'd ever earned as a teenager, along with meticulously kept records of something that made my blood run cold. Rent receipts, made out in my name, for every month from age 13 to 18. My name is Catherine Patterson. I'm 52 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought my parents had been struggling financially during my teenage years. I believed the story they told me about needing my help to keep our family afloat. I was proud of working those long hours after school and on weekends, proud of contributing every penny to what I thought was our survival fund. The cramped apartment we lived in, the secondhand clothes, the meals of rice and beans, it all seemed to justify their request for my wages. My hands shook as I called my husband David Patterson from my mother's dusty attic. 25 years of marriage had taught him to recognize when something was seriously wrong, and the tremor in my voice immediately put him on alert. "David, I need you to come over here. To Mom's house. I found something in her papers that I can't make sense of." I could barely get the words out. "It's about the money I earned as a kid." While waiting for David to arrive, I continued digging through the box with morbid fascination. There were bank statements showing regular deposits of my earnings into an account I'd never known existed. My mother had been telling me we were barely scraping by while systematically collecting and banking every dollar I earned from age 14 through 18. The rent charges were listed as household contribution fees in her ledger, as if charging a child for their own bedroom was a normal business expense. The most devastating discovery was a handwritten note tucked between the bank statements. Catherine's contribution fund, college account. College account. I'd never gone to college because my mother claimed we couldn't afford it. I'd spent my early 20s working minimum wage jobs and watching my friends pursue degrees, while believing higher education was a luxury our family simply couldn't manage. "We need to call Rebecca," David finally said, referring to my best friend Rebecca Martinez, who worked as a financial advisor. "She'll know how to interpret these documents properly. Maybe there's something we're missing." "Catherine, I'm going to be completely honest with you," Rebecca said after reviewing everything twice. "These records show a systematic collection of your earnings with documented rent charges that would have been legally questionable given your age. The college fund notation suggests your mother was claiming to save for your education while simultaneously charging you living expenses." But what I discovered next, the pattern snapped into place. My hands trembled as I pulled out a manila folder labeled Property Records that had been tucked beneath all the bank statements. Inside were documents I never expected to find. Real estate papers showing that my mother had purchased a rental property 3 blocks away in 1995, just 6 months after I'd started paying her rent. "Rebecca, look at this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The purchase date was circled in red ink, and in my mother's familiar handwriting were the notes. Down payment, $8,000. Monthly mortgage, $650. Rebecca's eyes widened as she compared the dates. "Catherine, this property was bought right around the time your rent payments started showing up in these records. And look at these monthly amounts." I felt something inside me fracture. Not just disappointment or anger, but a fundamental shift in how I understood my own life story. All those years, I'd believed I was helping my struggling family. I'd actually been funding my mother's real estate investments. The teenager who worked double shifts and handed over her paychecks had been building someone else's wealth while being told the family was barely making ends meet. The air felt too thick to breathe. I sank into my mother's kitchen chair, the same chair where she'd explained to 18-year-old me why college wasn't financially possible for our family. The same kitchen where she'd counted my work earnings and calculated my monthly household contributions while secretly building a real estate portfolio. "I need to understand something," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My mother isn't just frugal or overly cautious with money. She systematically took my teenage earnings, charged me rent as a minor, and used that money to invest in property while telling me we were too poor for me to go to college." David reached for my hand. "That's exactly what these documents show. This isn't about different perspectives on money management, Catherine. This is about deception." I thought about all the conversations over the years where my mother had praised my work ethic and responsibility as a teenager. How she'd told friends and relatives about her daughter, who was so mature, so willing to contribute to the family. I'd always felt proud when she talked about my character, never realizing she was describing her own financial scheme. The worst part is how proud I was, I admitted to David and Rebecca. I actually felt good about sacrificing for my family. I thought I was being noble and responsible. "You were being noble and responsible," David said firmly. "You were a kid doing what your parent told you was right. She's the adult who manipulated that goodness." Rebecca was still examining the property documents when her expression changed. "Catherine, there's something else you need to see. These papers show she sold that property 2 years ago." My heart stopped. "Sold it? For $340,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage, she would have cleared about $280,000 in profit." Rebecca's voice was gentle but clear. "Your teenage rent money didn't just buy her a property, it bought her a property that she recently sold for a massive profit." But that wasn't even the biggest shock waiting for me in those papers. Rebecca hesitated before handing me another folder, this one thicker than the others. "There are more properties, Catherine." My hands trembled as I opened it. Property deed after property deed, all in my mother's name. Purchase dates spanning from when I was 16 until just 3 years ago. A duplex bought when I was 17. A small commercial building purchased the year I graduated high school. Another house bought and flipped 2 years later. "How many are there?" I whispered. 7 properties total over the years. All purchased, improved, and sold. Rebecca's voice was clinical, but I could hear the anger underneath. "The financial records show a clear pattern. Every time you paid rent, every time your earnings went into that household account, the money was transferred within days to property investment accounts." David was reading over my shoulder, and I felt his body tense. "Catherine, look at this timing. She bought the duplex literally the same month you started that job at the grocery store." I stared at the documents, my childhood reframing itself with each page. Every Saturday morning I'd worked instead of sleeping in. Every birthday money I'd dutifully contributed to the family finances. Every time I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for lunch to save money while my mother was building a real estate empire. "I need some air," I said, standing abruptly. The kitchen felt too small, too full of the ghost of my teenage self counting out bills at that same table. I walked out to the small back porch, David following close behind. The yard looked exactly the same as when I was growing up. But now I wondered if my mother had been too busy managing her property portfolio to maintain it properly. David leaned against the porch railing. "While she was literally building wealth with your labor." "On at least 3 of the property's tax documents, yes. It gave her certain legal advantages for claiming expenses and deductions." I sat down heavily on the porch steps, My mother hadn't just taken my money. She'd systematically exploited our relationship for financial gain. Every conversation about responsibility and family contribution had been calculated manipulation. I trusted her completely, I said. Even when things felt unfair, I believed she had our family's best interests at heart. David sat beside me. You were supposed to be able to trust her. That's what parents are for. We sat in silence for a few minutes before Rebecca joined us on the porch. Catherine, I've been thinking about something. Where is your mother now? These documents suggest she's been managing significant wealth for years, but this house... She gestured around the modest property. It doesn't match someone with her apparent resources. That was the question I'd been avoiding. Where was my mother? And what was she doing with the wealth she'd built on my teenage labor? I pulled out my phone and stared at it. I hadn't spoken to my mother in 6 months. Not since our last awkward conversation where she'd criticized my marriage and suggested I was being irresponsible with money. The irony now was almost too much to bear. I think, I said slowly, it's time I called her. My finger hovered over my mother's contact information. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hands. David shifted closer on the porch step. Then at least you'll know where she stands. But Catherine, you have documentation now. She can't pretend this didn't happen. Rebecca nodded, still holding the stack of property records. These numbers don't lie. She took thousands from you over the years and turned it into a real estate portfolio worth more than most people's retirement accounts. I dialed the number before I could lose my nerve. The phone rang twice before my mother's familiar voice answered. Catherine, this is unexpected. How are you doing, sweetheart? The casual endearment made my stomach turn. Hi, Mom. I'm actually at your old house right now, going through some papers. There was a pause. Oh? Why would you be doing that? Rebecca is helping me understand some financial documents we found. Mom, I need to ask you about the rent money you charged me when I was 16. Another pause, longer this time. Catherine, we've talked about this before. I was teaching you responsibility. You needed to understand how the real world works. The real world doesn't usually involve parents taking their teenager's entire paycheck and then charging them rent on top of it. My voice was steadier than I felt. You're being dramatic. I provided for you, gave you a roof over your head, food on the table. That money helped support our family. Rebecca leaned forward, whispering, Ask her about the properties. I took a deep breath. Mom, what properties did you buy with that money? The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. I don't know what you mean, my mother finally said, but her voice had changed. The casual warmth was gone. The rental properties, Mom, the ones where you listed me as a tenant on the tax documents, the ones you bought with money from my job at the diner. Catherine, I think you're confused about some things. Maybe we should talk about this later when you've had time to think more clearly. I'm thinking very clearly. For the first time in years, actually. I stood up, pacing across the small porch. You took money from a 16-year-old girl working double shifts and built yourself a real estate empire. Then you made me feel guilty for wanting to go to college. I never stopped you from going to college. You chose not to pursue it. Because you convinced me we couldn't afford it while you were literally sitting on property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. David reached for my free hand, steadying me. Rebecca was taking notes on the back of one of the property documents. Catherine, you're getting very upset about something that happened a long time ago. I did what I thought was best for our family's financial security. Our family's security? Or your financial portfolio? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. I won't be spoken to this way by my own daughter. When you're ready to have a mature conversation about family finances, you can call me back. Mom, wait! The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking. She hung up on me. David stood and put his arm around my shoulders. She knows you found out. That's why she ran. Rebecca looked up from her notes. Catherine, during that call, did you notice she never actually denied owning the properties? She deflected and tried to make you feel guilty, but she didn't deny a single fact. She also didn't explain why she's not living in any of them, David added. Someone with that much property wealth shouldn't be unreachable or evasive about where they live. I looked at the modest house behind us, then at the stack of documents in Rebecca's hands. My mother had built an empire on my teenage labor, but something about her current situation wasn't adding up. Rebecca, I said slowly, what if we tried to find out where she's actually living now? Rebecca studied the property documents again, cross-referencing addresses on her phone. I've been looking at these properties, and something doesn't make sense. 3 of these are listed as rental units, but the addresses show they're in different states. Different states? I sat back down, trying to process this information. Mom moved around a lot when I was younger, but I thought she'd settled somewhere permanent by now. David frowned. Wait, you haven't actually seen your mother in person recently, have you? When was the last time you were in the same room with her? 4 years, Rebecca repeated quietly. Catherine, what if she's been avoiding face-to-face contact for a reason? I stood up again, unable to sit still. The familiar patterns of my mother's behavior were becoming clearer, but more disturbing. She used to do this when I was little. Whenever I'd ask difficult questions about money or why we moved so much, she'd create some crisis or distraction to change the subject. The questions sparked a memory I'd pushed aside. Last Christmas, she called asking if I could help her with her electric bill. Said she was having a tough month. I sent her $300. David's expression darkened. While she was collecting rental income from multiple properties? Rebecca looked up from the documents. Catherine, I think we need to consider the possibility that your mother has been running some kind of long-term financial manipulation. Not just with your childhood earnings, but continuing into your adult life. The words hung in the air between us. I'd spent so many years making excuses for my mother's behavior, explaining away the inconsistencies and the emotional manipulation as just her way of coping with life's difficulties. But she's my mother, I said, the phrase sounding weak even to my own ears. That doesn't give her the right to deceive you about money, David said gently. Parents are supposed to protect their children's financial interests, not exploit them. Rebecca and David exchanged a look. After 4 years of avoiding face-to-face meetings, now she suddenly wants to meet in person? Rebecca said. Right after you confronted her about the properties? Where does she want to meet? David asked. I typed back quickly. Where and when? The response came within seconds. Tomorrow. I'll come to you. At exactly 2 o'clock, my mother knocked on my door. When I opened it, I was struck by how different she looked. Usually, she maintained a carefully controlled appearance, but today her hair was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Catherine, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. We need to clear the air about some things. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, her voice carrying a tone I'd rarely heard from her before. It wasn't quite remorse, but it wasn't her usual defensive posture either. About the house, about your childhood earnings. I realize how it must have looked to you. How it looked? I kept my voice steady, remembering Rebecca's advice about not letting her control the narrative. Mom, you took every dollar I earned for 4 years and told me it went to basic living expenses. Then you secretly bought property with money that should have been mine. She flinched slightly at the directness. It's more complicated than that. Then explain it to me. And please, for once, just tell me the truth. My mother was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. Your father left us with so much debt, Catherine. Credit cards, loans I didn't even know about. When he walked out, I discovered we were 3 months behind on the mortgage, and I had less than $200 in my checking account. I waited, sensing there was more. But something changed, I said, beginning to see where this was headed. She nodded slowly. By the time you were 16, I'd managed to stabilize things. I got the promotion at work. We caught up on the major bills. But I kept taking your money anyway. I told myself I was saving it for your future, that I'd give it to you when you turned 18. But you didn't. No, I used it as a down payment on the rental property in Michigan. I convinced myself that building assets was better than just handing you cash. That eventually, you'd benefit from the investment. The admission hung between us. Part of me felt vindicated that she was finally telling me the truth, but another part felt hollow. All those years of believing we were on the edge of financial ruin. All the guilt I'd carried about not contributing enough to help my struggling single mother. The confession hit me harder than I'd expected. So you manipulated me into feeling guilty for your fake financial problems because you wanted to feel needed? I thought about Marcus and how he'd talked about our mother's need to control, her difficulty with his independence. The pattern was becoming clearer, but that didn't make it hurt less. Mom, you weren't losing me because I became independent. You were losing me because you kept lying to me. Every fake financial crisis, every guilt trip about money, it made me trust you less. She started crying then, not the dramatic tears she'd used during arguments when I was younger, but quiet, genuine sobs. I've made such a mess of everything, she said. I wanted to protect our relationship, but instead, I've destroyed it. For the first time in years, I felt a genuine surge of empathy for my mother. Not the guilt-driven compliance she'd trained into me, but actual understanding of her fear and loneliness. It doesn't have to be destroyed, I said carefully. But things have to change. No more lies about money, no more manipulation. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on honesty. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. What about the properties, the money I took from you? I know I owe you, but if I sell everything now, it'll create tax problems, and the market isn't great for— Stop, I interrupted, recognizing the beginning of another manipulation attempt. We'll figure out the financial stuff, but only after you prove to me that you can have a conversation without trying to manage the outcome. My mother fell silent again, and I could almost see her struggling against decades of ingrained behavior patterns. There's something else I need to tell you, she said finally. About Marcus. My stomach dropped. What about Marcus? He knows about the properties, about what I did with your money. He figured it out about 2 years ago when he was helping me with some tax paperwork. He confronted me about it, she continued. Told me I needed to make it right with you. We've been fighting about it ever since. That's part of why we haven't been getting along. I thought about Marcus's behavior during our recent conversation. His careful questions, his obvious discomfort when I'd told him about my discoveries. He'd been trying to get me to uncover the truth without betraying our mother's confidence. He's been protecting both of us, hasn't he? I said, understanding flooding through me. trying to give you chances to come clean while still being loyal to me." She nodded. "He said he wouldn't tell you himself, but he wasn't going to help me hide it anymore either. He's a good son, Catherine. Better than I deserve." My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How's it going? Need me to come over?" "Mom," I said, "I think it's time we called Marcus. All three of us need to have an honest conversation about what happens next." But as I reached for my phone, my mother's expression shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something calculating in her eyes before she quickly looked away. "Actually," she said, "maybe we should keep this between us for now. Marcus has been under a lot of stress lately, and I don't want to burden him with more family drama." The familiar manipulation attempt sent a chill through me, and I realized that despite everything she'd just admitted, some patterns were going to be much harder to break than others. I set my phone down and looked directly at my mother. "No, we're not keeping this between us anymore. That's exactly the kind of compartmentalization that got us into this mess in the first place. Catherine, please." "Mom, do you hear yourself? You just spent 20 minutes telling me how sorry you are and how you want to make things right. And now you're trying to manipulate me into excluding Marcus from a conversation that directly affects him." She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "That's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to protect him." "From what? From having an honest conversation with his family? Or are you trying to protect yourself from having to face both of your children at the same time?" "Maybe both," she admitted quietly. "I know how this looks, Catherine." "I know what I've done to both of you, but facing you one at a time feels more manageable than being accountable to your whole family at once." I picked up my phone again. "Mom, if you're serious about changing, this is where it starts. No more dividing and conquering. No more managing conversations to get the outcome you want." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "What if he's angry with me for telling you? What if he thinks I should have found a way to make this right without involving you? Then we'll deal with that honestly too. But Marcus has been carrying this secret for 2 years, trying to navigate between loyalty to you and loyalty to me. Don't you think he deserves to stop being the middleman?" My mother looked up at me, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw genuine vulnerability instead of calculated emotion. "I'm scared, Catherine. I'm scared that if both of you are in the same room hearing all of this at once, you'll decide I'm not worth the effort it's going to take to fix our family." The admission caught me off guard. I'd been expecting more manipulation, more attempts to control the situation. Instead, she'd named the fear that was probably driving most of her behavior. "Mom, that decision isn't going to be made in one conversation. But if we're going to have any chance of rebuilding trust, we need to stop operating from a place of fear and start operating from a place of honesty." I pulled up Marcus's contact and started typing. "Can you come over? Mom is here and we need to talk. All three of us." Before I could hit send, my mother spoke again. "Wait. If we're really doing this, I need to tell you something else first." My finger hovered over the send button. "What?" "The properties aren't the only thing. There's more money involved. Money I took from you that didn't go into real estate. I used some of your earnings to pay for Marcus's college expenses, and some of mine too, when I went back to school for my certification." I stared at her, trying to process this new information. "You used my childhood earnings to pay for education expenses?" I told myself it was still keeping the money in the family, that everyone would benefit if Marcus and I were more educated, more successful. But I know now that it wasn't my decision to make. The rationalization was so typical of her that I almost laughed, except nothing about this situation was funny. So you took money from my labor as a child and used it to invest in other people's futures? Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I sent the text to Marcus, then set my phone aside. Mom, do you understand that what you're describing isn't just financial mismanagement? You literally profited from child labor. My labor. I know that now. At the time, I convinced myself that parents make financial decisions for the whole family, and this was just another one of those decisions. Except it wasn't your money to make decisions about. I earned that money through my own work. She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. I've been living with the guilt for years, Catherine. Especially watching you struggle financially while knowing I had resources that were rightfully yours. My phone buzzed with Marcus's reply. On my way. Everything okay? I showed the message to my mother. He's coming, and when he gets here, I want you to tell him everything you just told me. No editing, no protecting him from the truth. What if this destroys our family completely? Mom, secrets and manipulation are what's been destroying our family. The truth might be painful, but at least it's something we can actually work with. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know how to do this, Catherine. I don't know how to be honest without trying to control how people react to that honesty. We'll figure it out as we go. But the first step is committing to telling the truth even when you can't manage the consequences. 20 minutes later, I heard Marcus's key in the front door. He'd kept his key from when he'd helped me move in, and I'd never asked for it back. Catherine? Mom? His voice carried surprise and concern as he appeared in the living room doorway. My mother looked up at him, and I could see her struggling with the impulse to craft her words carefully. Marcus, sit down, please. I need to tell you both some things, and I need to tell them honestly this time. Marcus glanced between us, clearly sensing the weight of whatever was about to happen. Okay, but first, Mom, I need you to know that I'm glad you're finally having this conversation with Catherine. It's been eating me up, keeping that secret. I know, she said, and I'm sorry I put you in that position. But even as she said it, I caught something in her expression that made me wonder if she was already calculating how to use Marcus's relief as a way to minimize her own accountability. The pattern was so ingrained that I wasn't sure she even realized she was doing it anymore. Marcus settled into the chair across from us, his expression shifting from concern to wariness as he took in the gravity of our faces. What's going on exactly? I've been telling Catherine the truth about what happened with her work money, Mom said. All of it. Oh. Marcus leaned back slightly, and I could see him processing what that meant. How much of it? The rent scheme, the fact that I kept her earnings, the investment account. Mom's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly. Everything. Marcus looked at me. How are you doing with all this? Honestly, I'm still processing it. Part of me is relieved to finally understand what happened, but another part of me is trying to figure out how to move forward from here. Mom, can I ask you something? Marcus turned to face her fully. When you asked me not to tell Catherine about the money, did you already know you were going to tell her yourself eventually? I watched Mom's face carefully, looking for those subtle signs of calculation I'd started recognizing. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then looked down at her hands. I'm trying to be completely honest here, she said slowly. And the honest answer is that I hoped I would work up the courage to tell her, but I wasn't sure I actually would. Part of me was hoping that maybe the secret could just stay buried. But it couldn't, I said, because every time I struggled with money, Every time I mentioned not being able to afford something, you knew you had resources that belonged to me. Marcus rubbed his forehead. Mom, those conversations were torture. Catherine would tell me about having to choose between groceries and gas money, and I knew you had thousands of dollars that should have been hers. How long has this been going on? I asked. How long have you two been having these conversations? Marcus glanced at Mom, then back at me. Since about 6 months after you moved out. I asked Mom about what happened to all the money you earned in high school, and she eventually told me the truth. 6 months. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. So, for almost 2 years, you both knew about this money while I was struggling? Catherine, I wanted to tell you so many times, Marcus said. But I also didn't want to destroy Mom's relationship with you without giving her a chance to make it right. And I kept asking for more time because I was terrified, Mom added. I knew that once you learned the truth, everything would change between us. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street. The thing is, everything was already changing. I was already pulling away from you, Mom, because I could sense something was wrong. I just didn't know what it was. I noticed that too, Marcus said quietly. You stopped calling as much, stopped coming over for dinner. Mom's tears started flowing again. I did that to you. I made you doubt yourself when the problem was what I had taken from you. The hardest part, I continued, is that you watched me struggle and didn't just stay silent about having my money. You actively gave me advice about budgeting and financial responsibility. Oh, God. Mom put her face in her hands. I did do that, didn't I? Multiple times. You told me I needed to learn to live within my means. You suggested I get a second job. You even criticized me for not having an emergency fund. Marcus looked horrified. Mom, you didn't. I did. I absolutely did. Mom looked up, her face blotchy from crying. I was so deep in justifying what I'd done that I actually convinced myself Catherine needed to learn these lessons the hard way. While you had $17,000 of my money earning interest, I said. The number hung in the air between us. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. 17,000? He looked at Mom. You told me it was around 10. Mom's face went very still, and I felt that familiar chill of realizing there was still more to uncover. Mom? I said slowly. Is there something else you haven't told us? Mom shifted in her chair, and I could see her calculating something behind her eyes. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. The 17,000 is what's in the account now, she said finally. But Marcus, when I told you it was around 10, that was what I had saved initially. What do you mean, what's in the account now? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. I kept adding to it, Mom said quietly. After you moved out, I felt so guilty about what I'd done that I started putting money aside each month, thinking I would eventually give it all to you. Marcus leaned forward. How much money did Catherine actually earn in high school? Mom looked down at her hands. About $8,500. So you're telling me, I said slowly, that of the $17,000 in that account, only $8,500 is actually money I earned? The rest is money I added over the past 3 years, plus some interest. I started pacing again, my mind racing. This changes everything, Mom. This isn't just about you keeping my earnings anymore. How does it change things? Marcus asked, looking confused. Because now it's not just about returning what was mine, I said. Now she's trying to buy forgiveness with money that was never part of the original problem. Mom stood up abruptly. That's not what I was doing. I was trying to make it right. By making the decision for me? By not telling me you were doing it? I turned to face her. Mom, for 3 years you watched me struggle financially while you were secretly putting money aside that you planned to give me someday. Do you not see how messed up that is? Marcus rubbed his temples. I had no idea about any of the extra money, Mom. You told me you were keeping Catherine's work money safe, not that you were adding to it. But you weren't helping, I said. You were helping some future version of me while the present version of me was eating ramen for dinner 3 nights a week. Mom sat back down heavily. I know it doesn't make sense. I know it was wrong. I just kept thinking that when I finally gave it to you, the extra amount would show how sorry I was. The extra amount shows how long you let me suffer unnecessarily, I said. Marcus looked between us. Catherine, what do you want to do now? I mean, knowing all this? I stopped pacing and looked at both of them. Honestly, I don't know. 20 minutes ago, I thought this was about getting back money I earned in high school. Now I find out my mother has been playing some kind of psychological game with money for 3 years. It wasn't a game, Mom said quietly. There's something else, isn't there? Marcus said suddenly, looking at Mom with a sharp expression I'd never seen before. Mom, what else haven't you told us? Mom's face went completely pale, and she looked down at her hands folded in her lap. The silence stretched so long, I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Mom? Marcus pressed gently. What else is there? She took a shaky breath. The rent money. The $100 a month you paid me, Catherine. I kept that too. It's all there, in the same account. Every month for 2 years, I deposited it, but I never spent it. I told myself I was teaching you responsibility, but I always planned to give it back eventually. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, his hands on his hips. Mom, that's $2,400 on top of everything else. So let me get this straight, I said, my voice eerily calm. You charged a 16-year-old rent for living in her childhood bedroom, took her work earnings, then secretly kept all of it while watching her struggle financially as an adult. Is there anything else you've been hiding? No, Mom whispered. That's everything. $2,400 in rent, plus how much in work earnings? I asked. About $1,800 from your original job money, plus the extra I added makes it close to $8,000 total. Marcus turned around from the window. $8,000, Mom. Catherine could have paid off her credit cards, could have gotten a better apartment, could have had an emergency fund. I know, Mom said, still not looking at either of us. I know how it sounds. How it sounds? I repeated. Mom, do you understand what you did? You created a fake financial lesson that was actually just hoarding my money while I struggled with real adult consequences. Dad finally spoke up from his chair. Your mother's been losing sleep over this for months. I kept telling her to just give you the money and explain, but she was terrified you'd never forgive her. So instead, she let me stress about money while she sat on a solution? I said. That's worse, Dad. That's so much worse. Mom looked up at me with red eyes. I kept thinking if I waited until the right moment, if I had enough saved up, it would somehow make up for taking it in the first place. There was never going to be a right moment, Marcus said. Every day you waited was another day of Catherine struggling unnecessarily. I sat down hard on the couch, feeling completely drained. I don't even know how to process this. 3 hours ago, I came here thinking you owed me about $2,000. Now I find out you've been sitting on $8,000 while I've been living paycheck to paycheck. What can I do? Mom asked. How can I fix this? You can start by giving me the account information right now, I said. No more waiting for the right moment. No more surprise amounts. No more secrets. Mom nodded quickly and got up to get her purse. She pulled out a small notebook and copied down numbers on a piece of paper. The account is at First National. I'll call them tomorrow and add you to it, then transfer it all to your checking account. No, I said firmly. I'll go with you tomorrow and you'll transfer it while I'm there. No more handling my money without me present. Dad cleared his throat. Catherine, I want you to know I didn't know about the rent money. I thought she was actually using that for household expenses. Did you know about her adding extra money to the account? No, he admitted. I knew she was keeping your work money safe, but I didn't know about the rest. Marcus sat back down. This is bigger than just money, isn't it? Mom, why didn't you trust us enough to be honest about what you were doing? By telling the truth, I said, taking the paper from her. By trusting that I'm adult enough to handle complicated situations. By not making decisions about my life without including me. I was trying to protect you, Mom said. From what? Having my own money? I shook my head. Mom, you weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself from having to admit you made a mistake. Marcus leaned forward. Catherine's right. And Mom, you made the problem worse by hiding it instead of dealing with it. Mom nodded slowly. I see that now. I see how backwards it all was. I looked at the account information in my hand. Tomorrow we go to the bank together. You transfer all of it to my account, and then we figure out how to move forward from there. Will you be able to forgive me? Mom asked quietly. I don't know, I answered honestly. Right now I'm hurt and angry and confused. But I can't work on forgiving you until I know there are no more secrets. There aren't, she said firmly. I promise you, that's everything. Then tomorrow we start over, I said, but this time with honesty. Drop a comment. When did the pattern click for you?